And a good chilly morning to all of you as well. It's a little cooler today than it has been the last few days I've opened the show. You realize, though, every day is just one day closer to all of those sprouts coming up and lots of sunshine and really hot weather and dust storms and all of those wonderful things that come when we actually move out of the winter period. Perhaps maybe sometimes winter seems like the respite once you're in the middle of high summer. I do want to point out 25 right now. We have 8:07. Actually, it's 7 minutes after 8 o'clock. There is no O in the numbers, obviously, but we know the difference, right? 0 and O, and it's just a quick way to read that off. I had an old school teacher who'd get all over us if we said something like that. Obviously, she had never been in the broadcast business. You are listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX. You can also be listening to us online at newsradio1310.com today, and I do hope you have a pleasant day, and I'm going to try to get you started by putting your minds to work on a couple of issues. Three, actually, to begin with. Just one, I want to mention this quickly. We may get to it a bit later. There is a great piece today in the USA Today. Yes, that publication still exists. It's a joint column by Cal Thomas and Bob Beckel, and they are both writing about Islam. I mean, they're doing a Q&A with each other, talking about how we deal with that in this country and really around the Western world. And they come to an agreement, even though the two men are on opposite sides of the political spectrum. If we get an opportunity, we'll touch base on that a bit later this morning. Also, the same-sex marriage argument, I hate to say this, looks like it's pretty well a done deal. And we have the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco last week, that is the Flower Power Court, has already told Idaho, sorry, no dice. And we have the U.S. Supreme Court, which said they would not hear a case out of Louisiana this week. As I said, they're pretty much trying to wash their hands of the entire issue. I'd like to talk about that a little later this morning as well, in relation to how Christians who personally oppose it are being treated. In other words, their rights apparently don't matter as much as the people who actually are campaigning for same-sex marriage, or as they've done. They hired a public relations firm and they call it marriage equality, and that's called salesmanship. But it's just sloganeering and branding and the like in order to try to soften the blow. I remember I went to cover one of these gay pride parades about 25 years ago with the television station I was working at, and it was like watching some sort of Roman bacchanalia roll down this street. People wearing nothing but G-strings and multicolored wigs. And you stood there, you were just thinking to yourself, it's like the circus is in town. And somewhere along the line, over the course of a decade, 10 to 15 years really, they started realizing that to market this to the American public, they had to start wearing dark suits and combing their hair properly and doing those things. Just like the old hippies learned when they got into politics. Bill Clinton cut his hair, Hillary Clinton got rid of the granny glasses, all of those things. It's all about marketing to a larger audience. And the other thing I'd like to talk to you about today is energy. I'll get that straight in a minute. I've maybe got a little bit too much energy. I just gulped a cup of coffee before I went on air, not knowing when I'd get another chance to turn around and pick that coffee up and take a sip. Energy. Front page story in the Times News today. Top of the fold. Solar power gains traction in Idaho. And the writer of the story, I'd like to give the writer's credit, Michael Matthews, is explaining how Idaho is eventually going to become, well, per capita, the leader in generating solar power in America. Now, the thing that I find interesting about this as I was reading through it, the first paragraph, a sudden surge in solar energy products puts Idaho on track to have more solar capacity per capita than any other state, which I've already said, says its largest utility company, and they're talking about Idaho Power. I had my first experience with Idaho Power yesterday, getting power set up in my new home. So a very simple process to go through. I do want to compliment them about that. You don't want to make the power company angry. They have a switch. They can turn it off at any time. It's a little easier than dealing sometimes with a cable company. They're going to come by and hook up my service sometime in calendar year 2018. At least that's what I gather from what they were telling me. You can have an appointment sometime in the middle of July, 3 years out. Why not just hire another tech if you're that busy? It doesn't make any sense to me, but that's how it seems to work. I moved on a few paragraphs in this story, and there's a quote from a spokesman for Idaho Power, and the spokesman says, quote, all of these contracts are for qualifying facilities under the federal PURPA law, meaning that Idaho Power is required to purchase the energy they produce, unquote. PURPA being an acronym for a much larger regulatory effort by the government. Now, I have a friend. He's from Nebraska originally. He's since moved out of Nebraska, and he's the president of an electric cooperative in a state somewhere in the United States. I don't want to give his name away. I don't want to get him in trouble. But he has often told me, off the record, that this is a bunch of baloney. This is a bunch of crap. He says the utilities don't want to deal with this, but because in order to maintain your monopoly in whatever area you're servicing, and we can't have 10 companies coming in and all stringing wires around. That would get a little bit cumbersome. So we don't have competition. But because of that, the government sets certain conditions. And so the government is telling these utilities, you are going to do this. You have no other choice. This is what you are going to do. And he says he's not at all happy about it. He said, I could give people much cheaper power, my customers, my co-op members, much cheaper power if I would be able to focus on coal. But the coal generating plant that his utility was relying on had 4 coal-burning units. 3 of them have been shut down by environmentalists. Number 4 is coming soon. So they've had to put up all of these giant solar panels, which in winter are covered in snow. They've done that. They've had their arms twisted into putting up the giant pinwheels, albeit none have actually been constructed yet as far as that project goes. But he explains, you could buy electricity for about a quarter of what you're currently paying for these alternatives. And we're just gouging people. And you will also notice he actually goes out when they have the openings of these new solar panels, whenever they put up a new farm. He goes out and smiles and stands there with a lot of politicians, and they all smile for the cameras. The politicians, many of them, don't want it either. They were in the minority, and they couldn't they didn't win this one, but they do go out and get their pictures taken at these events when they take place. It's not hypocritical. I think if you actually pulled them all aside, they would tell you we're opposed, but unfortunately, this is what we are forced to do. We are forced to be compliant. And we've talked about it before. Solar energy is just not yet being the operative word here, is not a viable form of energy. And it may not be a viable form of energy for another 50 or 60 years. That also would include the possibility of never. And if we could get it to be much more efficient, it would certainly fuel the world from here on out. But it's going to be a long, long time if it ever happens. And yet, here you go. Front page. Why is it above the fold in a front page story? Well, because, of course, the environmentalists at this newspaper, it is if you walk in there and you were to quiz everyone and they were truthful with you about what their political leanings are, they're somewhere between Democrat Party and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and often more closely attuned to the Khmer Rouge. And so that's what you're dealing with in American journalism. They are advocates for their own causes. Much like academics, they believe that all of their leftist causes are the new normal. And if you disagree with that, you're the troublemaker, and you need to be re-educated. You need to be forced out of your job. You need to be shunned. It's that way with a lot of issues. We'll talk about another one of those in a few minutes, another topic, but it's a similar type of thing that happens to be going on. Breaking news, just before we went on the air today, President Obama targets oil and gas industry, demands massive reduction in methane emissions. Once again, he's doing this by fiat. That's what a king does. The king says, this is the way I want it, and this is the way it will be. Think about that character in the Ten Commandments, Yul Brynner playing the Pharaoh. What was it? Let it be written, let it be done. We're looking at something like that, even though the president, and I have here my pocket Constitution issued by the Heritage Foundation, the president is just a co-equal branch of a government. There are 2 other stools. It's a 3-legged stool, but presidents in recent history, and I'm not just blaming this one, they have all come to believe somehow that they are kings and everybody else is working for them. And yet, the public buys into that a lot too. A friend of mine from high school one day, she said to me, how can you be so critical of our commander-in-chief? My friend is not in the military, so he would not be her commander-in-chief. Number 2, Article 2, Section 2 of that Constitution says that the president shall be the commander-in-chief when called to do so. Well, who would call the president to be the commander-in-chief? Well, that would be Congress. That would require a declaration of war, the last of which, I think, one of which took place was in December of 1941. So we're talking 3/4 of a century since anyone may have been technically commander-in-chief. So he's going to tell these people that they have to reduce these emissions. He is going to greatly. So here we are enjoying the benefits, the tremendous benefits of cheap energy when we go to the gasoline pumps. And here's a guy who wants to turn that around so you can pay more. He doesn't have to worry about it. He's chauffeured everywhere. He doesn't pay for the plane flights. He doesn't pay for the Chevy Suburbans that drag him all over the place. No, or the choppers flying in the air. That's all just, that's lavished upon him. How would he know? He hasn't had to drive himself anywhere in a decade at least. 8:17 right now. You're listening to Top Story with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I believe we have a caller with us. You're on the air.
Good morning, Bill. Hey, listen. You compare the employees of the Taiwanese to the Khmer Rouge? People, the people that kill so many people, Pol Pot and them? Come on.
I said you might find people, I didn't say the employees were all that way. I said you might find people who have some sort of affinity.
But I mean, compare anybody to Khmer Rouge to all the genocide that they made. That is utterly ignorant.
Well, bring your handcuffs over and lock me up then, for crying out loud, if you feel that way. And then you can send me off to the re-education camp and off me out in one of the killing fields, if you really feel that way. Inside every liberal is someone waiting to get out, break out, and do what they did in France after the revolution there in the late 1700s, 1789. There's an inner Robespierre in every liberal, and that is, in order to make you comply with their views, they will stop at nothing. And Robespierre started out as a fairly decent guy who thought that, everyone should be equal and that they should have all of these opportunities. But when people didn't react the way that the laboratory said they would, he just simply started chopping their heads off. And if you let liberals in this country take this to the end game, yes, it will resemble what the Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia. Hi, you're up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Good morning, Bill. You were talking about the liberals, basically liberal labeling. It's not enough that the people in Syria and Iraq, they say that they self-identify as Muslims, as fundamentalist Muslims who follow fundamental Islam, and then the liberals, they try to tell people who self-identify, they say, no, you're really not a Muslim because you don't know what Muslims believe, and Muslims are believe in peace. And
I'll share this in a little while. The liberals don't know what Christians believe. How could they possibly know what Muslims believe? And culturally, most liberals in this country are a lot closer to Christianity, or at least have some veneer of it in their lives. We'll talk about that in a few minutes in relation to an editorial in the Bible of the American Left, the New York Times. Stick around for that. Thank you much for both telephone calls. More of your calls on the way, too, as well. It's 25 right now, coming up on 20 minutes after 8 o'clock. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. To give you an idea, I don't want to delve into this much more, but to give you an idea of the mindset that operates at that newspaper when the governor took the oath of office the other day at the Capitol, there was a companion story about the demonstrator who happened to be there. That's not plural. One person, save the wolves, holding up a sign. One person. But that was a companion story to all of that. They had to make sure they got in that story, apparently, because, it's near and dear. I can recall I was working at a radio station, and we were competing with a Gannett newspaper. They've got newspapers all over the country. In the newspaper, we would have 1,500 people show up at a Tea Party event, and we might get some coverage on page, B8. Actually, I don't know that they had that many pages left anymore because newspapers have pretty well had to shrink. Something called Craigslist ate their lunch. But we would have the story buried. On the other hand, when the Occupy demonstration came along, and if you had 12 skanky hippies who needed a shower and hadn't had a haircut since 1967, that would be a front page story in that newspaper. Here's some old hippies playing volleyball at an Occupy demonstration. Excuse me, there's 8 people there. Yes, but this is really big news. Yeah, but we had 1,500 people the other day at the outside the state capitol. Well, yes, but you people are all knuckle-dragging racists with non-opposable thumbs. So that really wasn't news. No. They don't want to let people know is what it is, what it comes down to. Just how many folks out there are actually right of center. And this is still majority in this country. We are still a right of center nation. It's just that they're in denial about all of that, even after the election results this past November. 25 minutes after 8 o'clock, 25 right now, looking for a high today of only 30. Things will be warming up as we move toward the weekend, though. Be a little wet at times. Just to keep that in mind if you're going to be out doing some shopping on Saturday morning and clearing out a bit on Sunday. We have a caller with us. The number is 736-0300. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You can listen to us anywhere around the world, and you're on the air.
Hello. This is that extreme conservative you called a hippie a couple of weeks ago. Well, I got
you should take a Valium then. It might make you feel better.
I got your white paper, Scenario for the Future of Technology Development by the Rockefeller Foundation, May 2010. On page 18, they talk about how they really, really want to kill you and your families. Another one, National Security Memo 2000.
What's this got to do with what we're talking about today? If you want your own show, send in an application. But I do thank you for finding the evidence. Can you email that to me at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. I'll be glad to take a look at it, and we can make it a point of discussion for another day. But you know what? This is not the Alex Jones radio show, and it's not the you guys are coming across badly. If you're trying to sell your product, which is that we're all being scoped by the elites in this world, you got to come up with a better deal than that. Otherwise, they're going to lump you in with that guy who planned to poison Speaker Boehner's drink. So, you know what? You got to find a better sales pitch. You're up next. It's 8:27 on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Hey, Bill. The thing that I want to tell you is I'll tell you what it's going to take for these people to wake up on this energy crap. Is what's going to happen is it's going to be too late. That once they shut all this stuff down, and then I'll guarantee you, Bill, the first ones that are going to jump out there and start screaming of high energy bills and all that stuff is those left wingers. I mean, it's so insane.
They'll blame it on the big naughty utility companies and the greed of the people who have invested in them.
Absolutely. I mean, that is so. I don't know. I get so frustrated with those people, but I can see right now it's going to take that to wake them up.
Thank you for the call. When I was working on a U.S. Senate campaign in Michigan this past fall, I would be talking to voters, and they would tell me that my Republican candidate was a tool of the evil Koch brothers, who are libertarians, and they provide jobs to about 100,000 people. And then I would point out that their candidate on the other side was being funded by Tom. The billionaire. He is now planning a run for U.S. Senate, in fact, in California. But I would tell them that their candidate was backed by that guy and that he was worth billions, and they would get mad and they would just start shouting, like the Tasmanian devil. In other words, we don't want to hear your logic and facts. We've already made up our minds, no matter, how poorly we've done that. One other quick note on this energy issue. A writer by the name of Holman W. Jenkins Jr. at the Wall Street Journal is asking the question, what is General Motors thinking? General Motors is going to be revealing a car shortly that they'll have on the market in a few years called the Chevy Bolt. Not the Volt, but the Bolt, B-O-L-T, and it says you can get 200 miles per charge. And he's asking, you'll also, if you buy it, the government will pay $7,500 of your cost out of my pocket. Just like they do with the solar panels people buy, I end up paying for half of that. What they're going to do, he says, in Detroit is have to go to automobiles no bigger than little Fiats in the next 10 years to meet the CAFE standards that the president is going to. They're completely unrealistic, that he's going to be forcing down drivers' throats. And his successors may do the same unless in 2016 people actually wake up and start to realize what's going on around them. Because right now, we're all too busy, I guess, watching American Idol to fully grasp. A caller said to me years ago when the recession started, how did this happen? Where you been? We've got more on the way. Christians under fire because of their faith. Details on that in just a few minutes on News Radio 1310 KLIX. Top story with Bill Colley on newsradio1310.com. I think the French, and pardon it because I haven't had any French classes since, the spring of 1976. I was a freshman in high school, so it's been a few years, but I think they pronounce it fait accompli, which means it's a done deal. I think we're talking about same-sex marriage in the state of Idaho. I don't think there's much at this point that will that anybody in state government could do to block it. And I'm going to get into that in a few minutes, but I want to talk about a related story, and I think it speaks volumes about what the future holds for people of traditional values. Because while one side says you have to respect us and respect our rights, there isn't really much respect for people who actually hold to some sort of tradition and their rights. As we've seen, when they tell people who bake cakes and people who take wedding photographs that you have to do this, or people who have wedding chapels in their own homes that you have to perform these ceremonies, even if your faith says otherwise, that is just strong-arm thuggery. And when I mentioned earlier that continuum among liberals, from Democrat Party to the Khmer Rouge, or even going back to the French Revolution, this is what we're talking about. It's that need to force compliance upon other people whose views are different. There is an editorial in the Bible of American Liberalism, the New York Times, that I wanted to share just a little bit of with you and then give you my take on that. And some of you may agree with this. I know that some out there simply don't care. You'd like to oppress as many Christians or conservatives as possible. Well, all right. Then that pretty much proves the point that I've been trying to make. 25 right now. It's 8:35. On Top Story with Bill Colley on 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, where you can listen to us online anywhere around the world. You heard this story, I'm sure, about the fire chief in Atlanta, Georgia. He used to actually work in the Obama White House as well. He was recently fired. He wrote a book at his church where he talked about some of those traditional values, and he looks at homosexuality as an abomination. I once pointed that out on the air, that's what my grandmother had taught me when I was a kid. And some caller got really irate with me and, said, "You're calling it abomination." I said, no, my grandmother was quoting the Bible. And I'll get to that in a moment. But God Gaze in the Atlanta Fire Department, the title of the editorial at the New York Times, the writer says, as the book revealed, and this is the book written by the fire chief who was fired, his religious beliefs also include virulent anti-gay views. He was fired on January 6th by Atlanta's mayor, Kasim Reed, for homophobic language in the book. The book is titled, "Who Told You That You Were Naked?" And it says, among other things, he called homosexuality a perversion, compared it to bestiality and pedophilia, and said homosexual acts are, quote, vile, vulgar, and inappropriate, unquote. Now, you may not agree with that, but the fact of the matter is, I don't think anybody writing an editorial at the New York Times is at all familiar with the Bible, because you don't have to read very far into the Old Testament, and you'll also find it as well in Romans in the New Testament, condemnations of this behavior. But you know what? Moses was told by God, if you find these people engaged in these acts, take them outside the encampment and stone them to death. I don't think anybody writing at a newspaper has any idea. They're trying to say, hey, this is wrong. Jesus said to love everybody. That's the Jesus they learned about, that they heard about through some friends or watching a Christmas special on TV. They haven't been in a church since a wedding or a funeral 20 years ago. I know that I've encountered this before, and I'll quickly mention this. I used to work in the Ocean City, Salisbury, Maryland radio market. And one year, all of the local churches invited General Jerry Boykin to speak. Now, you may know who the general is. He's now with the Family Research Council, but he was cashiered in Iraq because he said that he knew his God was more powerful than the Islamic God. So he became a very controversial figure, especially among those on the left who think that all faiths are equal. Well, if all faiths are true, then none of them are actually true, but that's the point of the left. You don't need your faith. They are secretly, they'd like to all come out and admit that they are atheists. But he was going to speak at this breakfast. More than 2 hours drive away, a newspaper editor in Baltimore suddenly demanded that the mayor disinvite him because he did not believe all faiths were equal. Well, then it was explained to the newspaper editor, who didn't know that the mayor didn't actually sponsor the breakfast. The churches did. They called it the mayor's breakfast. So then the newspaper demanded that the mayor not attend the breakfast. And then the newspaper also demanded that all other politicians and community leaders not attend the breakfast because, well, you know, this man's a hater. And if you go to this breakfast, we'll be sure that we editorialize against you come the next election, which they always did anyway. It wasn't going to change that because all of the people in that part of the state were Republicans. On the eastern shore of the Chesapeake, it's vastly different lifestyle. And Boykin came and spoke anyway, and this just infuriated the newspaper, and I got the editor on the phone one day, and I said to him, "Are you a Christian?" He said, "Why, yes, I am." And I said, "Do you go to church?" No. I said, "Well, are you familiar with John 14:6? Long pause, and then, "No," he answered. And I said, "Well, Jesus said, 'I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.'" And I was just trying to make the point that General Boykin that's what he believes, and that's why he says these things. And the editor admitted he didn't know anything about Christianity in his conversation with me. And when I gave him that quote from the Bible, you know what the guy said to me? He said, "Is that all?" And then I heard a click. So they don't know any better. They think it's all just this touchy-feely, I'm okay, you're okay. They're clueless. And if you're that clueless, you shouldn't be writing about these things. Bill Colley with you on Top Story at News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We've got more coming up. I'll mention a couple of points, too, about that same-sex marriage argument. As I mentioned earlier, the judges that sit on that Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, they come out of that Volvo-driving, granola-chomping, hemp-clothing-wearing culture that they have in that community. Said last Friday that Idaho could not block same-sex marriage. Now, we don't know if the Supreme Court of the United States will ever even take up this matter because on Monday that same court in Washington declined to actually have a discussion or a ruling on some efforts to ban same-sex marriage in Louisiana. So it's only a matter of time. As I said earlier, fait accompli, I believe is the French word. It's only a matter of time before it sweeps all 50 states. Now, will it be the end of culture if that happens? Probably not. But I've got a couple of thoughts on that. It's 8:44 right now. You're listening to Top Story with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You can listen to us, in fact, online anywhere around the world. 26 now, so we're up a degree since we last spoke. But here's the thing about all of this. What does the word marriage actually mean? Well, we say it's the union, our definition in English, the union of a man and a woman. At least that's what it was originally supposed to be. But if you were to walk down the street tomorrow, let's say you're walking down a street in Twin Falls, and you run into two men or two women, and they tell you that they are married even though they aren't. Can you arrest them and lock them up for claiming to be married? No, you can't do that. Now, their view or their meaning of marriage is different than your meaning of marriage, so we're essentially just talking about semantics here. We're talking just primarily about our different view on what that definition is. So tomorrow, if we started calling, those of us on the traditional side, started calling it, I don't know, pick a word, blue-green. We called it blue-green instead of marriage. It wouldn't change it. It's just a symbol. It's like me being called Bill. That's my name, but it's not the totality of me. Bill is just a symbol. It's a way to identify me and do it that way. So why are we going through this in the first place? Why is there government involved? Because if two people want to be together, why do they need a permission slip from the government? Well, government does this because government can play games with taxes when it comes to, they can rig. So if we didn't have an income tax and we didn't have marriage, we went to some other type of tax, maybe the fair tax or something along those lines, it really would be irrelevant from the government's perspective. Now, my church will never, ever recognize same-sex marriage. And I don't believe anyone could ever force it because there will be such an uprising in the streets among that particular denomination, which is the largest Christian denomination in the world, they will never do that. And some other churches will not. But there are already some churches who perform these ceremonies, if you will. And those churches obviously would continue. But you don't have to go to those if you don't like what they're doing. And the same is true in reverse. If you are getting involved in a same-sex relationship, and if you come to my church and say, well, I want a Catholic wedding, you already know the rules. So you're not going to get one. It's a bit like when you say, I want that Christian over there to bake my cake. And I'm going to force that Christian to bake my cake. There's 500 cake makers you could go to, but you want to try to oppress that one to make a point. Or I want that person to take my wedding photographs, even though they believe in their own good conscience it may harm their soul. I don't care. I want them to do this. And again, I mentioned earlier, liberals are trying to push us in the direction, as I say, if you don't agree with them, and history is filled with this. French Revolution I cited. I cited the Khmer Rouge and everywhere in between, Soviets, Chinese government. If you do not comply with what they want, they will force you to do it. I'm going to get to my caller. Thank you for being patient. I'll get to you in just a moment. But this is the First Amendment. There's 5 liberties guaranteed in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. But it opens with, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Basically, it means the federal government's got to get out of it. And the fact of the matter is, there's no separation of church and state. I said I have my pocket copy of the Constitution here from the Heritage Foundation. Find me those words in this Constitution. You will not find them there. So the fact of the matter is, if my church says, no, we're not going to do this, and we believe that it would violate our conscience, you cannot force it upon people. The same way you can't enforce Obamacare on them with its birth control mandates and its abortion mandates. We have a caller with us at 8:48 on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Good morning.
Good morning, Bill. I looked up that site you were talking about in Scripture, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13. It states that if a man lies with mankind as with woman, they have both committed abomination. And,
right.
And that doesn't just stop there. That extends to a nation that will allow such a thing to happen.
Well, and you know, we as a nation have seen this march of liberalism over the last 50 to 60 years in this country, and we wonder why our cities are falling down. We wonder why 60 to 70% of children are born out of wedlock and there are no fathers around and with no role models, that the children join gangs and become criminals. I think that we can probably look back on that if you read through the Bible. I was just reading Nehemiah a few weeks ago, and it's all about some of the Jews were allowed to go back and try to rebuild Jerusalem. And while they were doing it, they were being attacked by Arab terrorists. And I thought, history repeats itself. It repeats itself over and over and over again. And you may be spot on about that. If you can't clean this up, and I thank you for the call. You may remember after 9/11, and the media had a cow about this too, because the media did not understand. They don't read the Bible. I'll get to this next caller. Hold on. I'll get to you in just a moment. But Jerry Falwell was having a conversation on television with, it might have been Pat Robertson, and I think the two of them said, well, in a nation that no longer wants God's protection, you're not going to get it. And people said, oh, people are saying that those two preachers, conservative preachers, are saying that we're being punished. Oh, that's just wrong. Well, no, what they were saying was, as a people, if you no longer ask God for his protection, he won't be there when you need him. That's an entirely different thing. But the evildoers in liberal media in this country don't know that because they haven't read the book. 8:51 right now. You're on Top Story with Bill Colley.
If I have a child, my child's doing something stupid that's going to get him killed, and I tell them that that's stupid, don't do that, you're going to get killed, is that me not loving them?
Yes.
That's exactly what I equate that to. If you know that homosexuality is destroying our country, and not only that, destroying the people that are in the act of it, and I don't say something about it, then that is hate.
Well, hold on for a minute, though. I have a lot of friends who are gay just simply because I used to live near the San Francisco of the East, Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. And so there were people that I got to be friendly with of that persuasion. They've already heard that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So at some point, we got to shake the dust from our shoes and move on.
Exactly. But it's not hateful for me to speak exactly what the Bible says. If you claim to be a Christian and act in an unchristian way, and I speak out, that's me speaking to my brother, saying, don't do this, you're going down the wrong path. That's not hate, that's love.
Right. And unfortunately, a lot of people do not know the basis of where you're coming from. And because of their own ignorance, they unfortunately claim that you're just being mean. End of story, right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Thank you much for the call. 852-26 on Top Story, News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I have a friend's, well, she's a friend too, but her husband's a friend. I was going to say a friend's wife. She is mentioning that she is listening online today, far, far away, because as she was explaining, apparently they have some sort of ice storm where they live. She was going to go off to the workout club this morning. I used to do that every day myself a long, long time ago. It's hard to believe when I look at myself in the mirror. I used to actually run 7 to 9 miles a day. And then my wife talked me out of it and said, I need you at home. And I eventually just found I wasn't doing it any longer, and it probably wasn't the best thing for me. But because of the ice storm, she can't go to her workout club. I think she's got all of the equipment at home, though, already. So she's there listening to the program today online. And I was told by her husband he had threatened not to come on the show as a guest in a couple of weeks because he thought I was going to cheer against Ohio State the other night, and I assured him that wasn't going to be the case. And the reason he's going to be on the program in a couple of weeks, we are going to be once again at an anniversary of the Shuttle Challenger explosion. Her husband was the administrator of the Shuttle Challenger Commission. And he's going to take a few minutes to talk about his experiences with us in a few weeks. And he's got a fast resume. You'd never know it from sitting down and talking to him because all right, there are people who've worked in government and the military who are normal, and he comes across as normal. I'm just saying my experience with a lot of those people hasn't been of normality. But he is what you'd call typical. He's from Ohio, and that being sort of Midwest gives you a pretty good idea that there's nothing abnormal there. Although, as the left would like to tell you, what is normal? I mean, how do you define normal? Oh, there really is no normal. They love to spring that one on you. Here's what normal is. When you see something and you get that knot in the pit of your stomach, then you know it's not normal. I think that's the best explanation for that I can come up with. And when I hear that line from these people, I know they are going to try to excuse something that they are doing that will just maybe potentially make me physically ill. You'll get that physiological reaction. 8:55 now. And if you'd like to reach our program this morning, you can touch base at 736-0300. The other part of this is we have these court rulings now coming down about same-sex marriage in Idaho. And up until a couple of weeks ago, when I got here and started working, my experience was there were a great many people, political people, who are more than willing to talk about it and more than willing to talk about their opposition. But since this ruling last Friday, I'm finding a lot of people that I've been approaching to see if they would like to have a discussion about it with me on the air, who in the past would have been publicly opposed, suddenly don't want to talk about the matter. Now, I'm not sure what that means. Maybe well, have you ever seen a politician checking the weather? They do it just about every 30 or 40 seconds. They wet an index finger, and then they pop it up into the air and see which way the wind is blowing. There is a great line in the movie Casablanca where Inspector Renault, he is talking with Humphrey Bogart's character Rick. Or it might have actually been with the Germans, but he said, I blow with wherever the wind blows, and right now it's blowing from Vichy, which was the German-controlled Nazi government of France after France had fallen. And so, in other words, I'm not going to stick my head out on anything because I'm going to ensure that I continue to have this job tomorrow and this salary tomorrow. And I just don't want to get involved with all of that. I think it is a terrible disservice to people to suddenly zip your lips on a topic like this. Voters would like to know where you stand from a political perspective. And the really courageous people will not change. You may not even like their positions, But the really courageous will maintain that integrity. I remember that line from the movie, and some of you may have seen this. I saw it when I was a kid. It was an Academy Award-winning movie called A Man for All Seasons about St. Thomas More, where he's at his trial, and they're getting ready to chop off his head. It's a show trial. And he sees the fellow who's actually perjured him in the courtroom, and he sees that the guy is actually played by John Hurt, I believe. He sees that he's wearing a chain of office, which was the guy's payoff for perjuring himself. And Thomas More says, "Why, Richard, that's a chain of office." And with that, the judge says, or the prosecutor says, played by Neil McKern, says, "Oh, well, Sir Richard has been named the Chief Attorney General for Wales." And with that, Thomas More says something along the lines of, "Why, Richard, it profits a man not to sell his soul for the world, but for Wales." We deal with a lot of that in politics still today. As I said earlier, history just repeats itself over and over and over again. It's 8:58. Bill Colley with you on Top Story today. We'll have news next from the Fox Radio Network. One more hour of the program ahead on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. You can hear us online anywhere around the world. And following news at 10 o'clock, following the next hour, Rush Limbaugh from 10 until 1 o'clock. Hope you can stick around. Look, I want to continue at least a little bit more with this theme about media and media being selective in its coverage, and because it just simply apparently doesn't understand or doesn't care